So first I'd just like to thank Jane and the organising team for putting together such a great conference and for inviting me to talk. I'm also really pleased to be here. So I'm going to be talking, as Brian said, about context awareness. Mobile phone apps or smartphones are able to, through the use of embedded sensors, detect and sense what's going on around us, our environment, but also infer how we're feeling, or at least start to infer how we're feeling and what's going on for us. This offers a lot of potential for tailoring behaviour change support for people who are trying to change their health behaviours. So the example I'm going to give is where we've tried to do this with a smoking cessation app. I'd also just like to thank my collaborators. By no means have I done this on my own. It's very much a collaborative work with others, and it's primarily I'm going to be talking about a study funded by the Medical Research Council in the UK. So I'm going to be talking about tailoring largely across during this talk. So I thought it was useful to start off with a kind of definition of what I mean by tailoring. So tailoring is where we would customize the support that people receive based on information about them. And the analogy is like if you get a tailored suit, then all the dimensions would be relevant to you and your suit would be made for you. Targeting is another approach often used, and this is where the support is customized to a group based on shared characteristics, so perhaps based on gender or age, and the analogy again is with a kind of off-the-shelf suit that you might wear. Maybe the sort of chest size might be relevant for you, but maybe some of the other dimensions don't quite fit. And then there's generic, or a one-size-fits-all approach. So a bit like borrowing clothes off a friend. You might be lucky they might fit, or they might be pretty baggy. So these are the kind of general approaches to tailoring or not tailoring support. Personalisation is a term that's often used as well, and personalisation really can operate at all three of these levels. You can personalise generic support by saying, "Hi Felix," and then the rest of the support is generic, and equally you can have something that's referred to as personalised, which is highly tailored as well. Those terms can be used interchangeably, but I'm using tailoring, using that kind of definition for this talk. So to give you an example of how tailoring might work, or why we might want to do it, this is a study we did some years ago. As part of the study, we randomised pregnant women who smoked to either receive a generic leaflet on the left or a tailored leaflet on the right. I don't expect you to be able to see the content from there, but you can get a sense that they look the same. And actually, broadly speaking, the information it provided was pretty similar, except the one on the right was tailored to 26 different characteristics of the individual. And what we found was that when we followed people up 3 months later, people who received the tailored leaflet were much more likely to report, they were more likely to report even receiving the leaflet, basically remember receiving the leaflet, that's how we interpreted that, more likely to have read it at least once, and then among those who did read it, more likely to feel it provided new information and more likely to feel it was written for them. And this highlights some of the mechanisms of tailoring. It makes people more likely to consume the information. They're more likely to perceive the information to be personally relevant, and really it should be more personally relevant. So hopefully it would be more effective by giving people better sort of suited behaviour change advice. But does it work? So I'm sort of focusing on smoking cessation here, but this is broadly found in other areas. So there's been a Cochrane review of print-based self-help showing that when you tailor self-help, you find a modest but significant impact on abstinence in smoking. So there is evidence that it enhances the impact of an intervention. There are fewer studies that have been done with digital interventions, so there hasn't a Cochrane review looking at sort of pooling together tailored versus non-tailored digital interventions, but individual trials support this, that tailoring does increase effectiveness. So, okay, with that in mind, and understanding that that smartphone apps have the potential to, because of their portability, the fact they're a computer, people like to input data into them, and people like using them, generally speaking. You'd expect a lot of smoking cessation apps, of the hundreds that are out there, to actually implement and incorporate tailoring. A review was done last year by Hopner and colleagues, published in Nicotine and Tobacco Research, and they found that of about 225 cessation apps they looked at, only 6 of those, or just under 3%, actually remembered information a user had input into the app to then later tailor the subsequent kind of interactions. There was evidence of more kind of immediate feedback tailoring, but that's probably a weaker definition of tailoring. Certainly it's not being widely implemented, despite there being a good reason for doing it. And I think Susan kind of mentioned this something similar earlier with one of their reviews, that although it's observational, it's not sort of indicating causation. Those apps that, in this review, those apps that did do some kind of tailoring were found to be downloaded more and had a higher rating. So maybe tailoring has something to do with that. So what kind of information do systems usually tailor to? Well, traditionally they tailor to things like the demographics or social characteristics, clinical sort of features and characteristics, people's past behaviour, and their beliefs or attitudes. And these are kind of relatively stable, so you can kind of usually get away with measuring them perhaps once. A good intervention might check in a few times to see if some of these things have changed. Obviously the demographics is unlikely to have changed, but people's beliefs obviously do change over time, and potentially in result of receiving intervention. But there are other things that predict our behaviour, in some respects more profound. So what people are currently doing at that time, what's in your current environment, and how you're feeling. And these are more transitory, they're changing more often. Obviously we'd have to record and log these things more frequently. And this has been sort of already talked about by Avril and Denise and Susan earlier on, about the importance of context and how context is starting to be incorporated into apps. So when it comes to tailoring, very broadly speaking, I've sort of split these up into what you could call characteristic tailoring, and then context tailoring. And despite the appeal of this, and everyone always nods their head and thinks it's a good idea, there are very few examples, certainly that I'm aware of in the academic literature. There may well be more in sort of other areas, where context tailoring has been used to adapt the support people get when they're trying to change their health behaviours. So I think this leads me on to talk about smoking. Yes, it does. Good. Okay, right slide. Okay, that was the sort of first bit about tailoring. I'm going to come back to that and combine that with smoking in a moment. But firstly, I wanted to talk about something which I think is not often considered as an important cause of relapse. So, we all know smoking is a chronic relapsing condition, but it turns out that early lapse, in the really early phase of a quit attempt, really compromises people's efforts to quit. Some really surprising, I found it surprising data, showing that if people lapse in the first week of their quit attempt, and then you follow them up and see if they're still smoking at 6 months, people who lapsed early on are 5 times more likely to have relapsed by 6 months. Okay, that again is a sort of correlation, not necessarily causation finding, but interestingly, this is supported by experimental evidence showing that when people were randomized to either have their lapse induced or not, that people who had their lapse, i.e. were asked to smoke 2 cigarettes during a quit attempt, they were much more likely to, they're twice as likely to have relapsed 2 weeks later. So I kind of thought, this is really interesting, but actually maybe does our data say this as well? So I went back to a trial that we did, the I Quit and Practice trial. It was a trial of 600 smokers receiving smoking cessation intervention in primary care. And I selected only those people who are abstinent at 4 weeks, and then dichotomized those people into either those people who reported an early lapse in the preceding 2 weeks, and those people who didn't, and compared their smoking status when we followed them up at 6 months, and we found the same thing. And I was really surprised that people who had this early lapse but were abstinent at 4 weeks, only 19% of them were abstinent at follow-up at 6 months versus 48% of those people who had no lapse. So lapsing early on does seem to compromise people's efforts to quit. So maybe if we can help people not lapse, that we might improve their chances of quitting. A major cause of lapse, again something that I think is kind of neglected, is the impact the environment has on us and the cues that we experience and the effect of that on, for smokers at least, on craving. So there's a type of craving called episodic craving or cue-induced craving. These are caused by factors in the environment like the presence of other smokers, the way the environment makes you feel, so your mood, and other kind of specific cues in that environment that may be unique to you, that through learned associations you get a consequence, a generation of a craving in response to that stimuli, and that leads to smoking. And there was two sort of points I wanted to point out about this particular type of craving. One, it seems to be very important. It's implicated in around half of all lapses to smoking. And the second is that the time between the onset of craving and smoking is pretty short. So for all these types of cravings that result in a lapse, about half of them occur within 11 minutes. So there's a very short, narrow window of opportunity potentially there to help sort of direct someone off the path of smoking. So this is where QSense comes in. So this is an app that we've developed, and to help us along, to help me sort of describe how the app works, I've created a sort of a character, not as good as Sean's real life character of Susan, I think it was. I've created fictitious Felix instead. So fictitious Felix works in a pub downtown, Naughton's. And he looks a bit grumpy. He's quite stressed with his job, and he smokes and he wants to quit smoking. So how it would work is that fictitious Felix would download QSense, and as part of the initializing process, when he answers some questions, he's asked to set a quit date. The only thing he's asked to do is to log each time he smokes leading up to that quit date. In real time. So when he might go out for a cigarette break, he presses the I'm smoking button on the app, and that triggers a survey. He completes a question about how he's feeling, his stress, his mood, strength of urges to smoke, how he would describe his current situation, so whether he's at home, socializing, working or other, and then who he's with and whether those other people are smokers. But what it also does is it works out, it takes, using location sensing, it takes a location kind of snapshot. And if he reports smoking more than once in the same location, then that creates a geofence around that area. So a geofence is like a virtual perimeter that the phone can see. And these geofences will be created for any locations where Felix reports smoking a number of times, or more than once, so that come quit date, when he enters into that geofence, in this case he's arriving at work, that will trigger the delivery of behavioural support. But it also takes into account what the app has learned about what was going on for him, what were the antecedents or apparent antecedents of smoking during that situation. So he reported quite high levels of stress, so the app can, as part of the support it would provide stress management support and advice. The app does other things. I'm not going to sort of focus on some of those other things just for the interest of time, sort of going to focus mostly on this. We've called this geofence triggered support. Support is triggered when you enter a location, a hotspot or a geofence, and also if you dwell within that hotspot for 3 hours. So it kind of keeps you going. So the two studies I'm going to sort of draw some findings from were part of this MRC grant, the Public Health Intervention Development Scheme, and they represent And I know that we've sort of talked about the MRC framework for the development and evaluation of complex interventions, and I realise I've suggested this is a linear process, and David and Susan rightly point out that at least it's an iterative process, and even then with digital interventions it may not be always fit for purpose. But anyway, just to highlight that it's sort of, these studies are sort of focusing on some of the identifying intervention targets, feasibility, acceptability, trial parameters and so on. Okay, first study I'm calling study 1 is a mixed method study where we collected app data and one-to-one interviews. Data was mixed at data collection, and we recruited a convenient sample of smokers, pretty much anyone who said they're willing to take part and were happy to make a quit attempt. They used the app before they quit, so this is the pre-quit date sort of phase, before their quit date. They set their own quit date, so for them this was an average about 19 days, and then post-quit we asked them just to use it for 2 weeks, and then we were going to interview them. And this is currently in press at the moment, this study. The acceptability study, or study 2, is also a mixed method study. We use 3 bits of data: app data, follow-up survey and one-to-one interviews. And this was much more sort of targeted towards the kind of people who we might expect to use this app. These were smokers who were receiving already or were interested in receiving smoking cessation support. They had a more realistic kind of pre-quit phase of around a week. That's probably more likely what you see with people who are actually kind of keen to quit. And then the app ran for 28 days in the post-quit phase, at which point all the kind of automated support ends. And that's the point we sort of followed them up. We interviewed a subsample of this based on sort of differences in interaction and usage. Okay, so some kind of findings from these 2 studies. So I'm going to be talking about a little bit about compliance, engagement, and then acceptability. These were some of the key things we're interested in. So people were able to report smoking and complete all those questions pretty quickly. It took them on average 13 seconds to do that. And compliance, however, was on the low side. People didn't always report smoking. So at the end of the day, people were asked to complete a survey where they said how many they smoked during that day, and we were able to compare that with actually how many times they reported. They underreported on around half of all days. There were a number of reporting barriers that we identified. Forgetting, not wanting to appear rude in social situations by pulling out your phone and doing something in front of someone when you're having a chat. Other environmental constraints like driving, and then when people relapse, they kind of didn't really see the point in carrying on, which makes complete sense. So these sorts of barriers are really useful, and they for the second study we implemented some kind of compliance promotion interventions within the app. But it also generates some really interesting behavioural info. We get a sense of where people smoke, which actually there's surprisingly little data on. So, and you can see from the numbers of reports, even with quite small samples, you get quite a lot of data. People mostly smoke at home, then work. Socialising, it's a bit low. Perhaps the sort of inhibitions with reporting affected that, and then other category covered about sort of 15% or so. It was interesting, it was so similar across the 2 studies, given the samples were a bit different, and it suggests that for 85% of smoking reports, these home, work and socialising categories kind of covered everything, right, for 85% of the time. As we know, technology doesn't always work, and in both studies, not everyone who is eligible to receive this geofence triggered support, so the support when people enter these geofences and it tailors it accordingly, not everyone received this. So in the first study, just over half of people eligible received them, and in the second study it was slightly better, around 70%. There are still some issues that some of which I've identified, some of which you need to understand a little bit more. Shows the importance of doing these sorts of studies before jumping straight into a trial. Sort of these sorts of issues could compromise a trial. Okay, so looking at engagement, the app generates a lot of notifications for these 40 odd people in the second study. There were 6,500 notifications over about 3 to 4 week period. And around 2/3 of these notifications are engaged with. That is, people will tap the notification and they'll view the message or the survey. Those are the two main types of notifications sent. The reason that for the other 35%, mostly that was because the app doesn't stack notifications. If another notification comes along, it'll delete the old one. So if people hadn't engaged with it up to that point, then that's deleted and it counts as one that's not engaged with. For geofence notifications, these are these messages that people get. It was slightly higher, about 3/4 of people engaged with them. What we were particularly interested, one thing I'm particularly interested in is how quickly it takes people to engage with these things. It's all very well to have the technology to intervene in real time, but if people aren't sort of viewing these messages in anything like real time, then we have to sort of rethink the way we might take this approach. And interestingly, people did engage pretty quickly. The median response time, so time it took for the notification to be generated, for them to tap it and view it, was 4.5 minutes. And you can see here a graphic which shows there's time along the bottom, and you can see the speed of response. This is 15 minutes here and 30 minutes there. So within 30 minutes, around 80% have viewed their message. Interestingly, for the same people, we compared the speed of response for just more sort of standard support messages that the app delivers, and we see a more gradual profile of response to that. I'm not entirely sure why people might respond more quickly to geofence messages, perhaps because they're more likely to be on the go, and so they've arrived somewhere, they might look at their phone as a sort of part of a habit of how they might use a phone. But we found that people responded much more quickly to the geofence messages. Disengagement, again, it's difficult to have an mHealth conference and not have disengagement talked about quite a lot. And this is a survival curve of the last time when someone completed an app survey or rated a message. So people can rate messages after they've received them. And you can see that, so the first kind of point is 20 days, the second point is 40 days. This line, around 38 days, is roughly when the automated support would end. So any kind of engagement after that would probably have to be instigated by the user. The system doesn't do anything automated at that point. And you see a sort of fairly steady drop off. It's a bit steeper at the beginning, but people do kind of drop off. Interestingly, if you compare that to a relapse curve, you find a pretty similar kind of pattern. So on the right here we've got a relapse curve. If you look at the central line, actually around the 38-day point, you get a pretty similar kind of rate of people who are still abstinent. And certainly when we spoke to smokers, they said for this, once they'd sort of relapsed and if they felt their quit attempt had failed, then they did say, I carried on engaging for a bit, but then I just thought, what was the point? And that makes sense. So I imagine this is the same for other health behaviours where, when people kind of relapse or give up on their attempts, then they're unlikely to continue to engage in an app that helps them to stop that. Moving on to acceptability, 3/4 said they'd use the app again. No one said they would. Oh no, a few people did say they wouldn't. But largely people were pretty positive about the app. Which surprised me a little how much engagement they were required to do. Some people had some privacy concerns, around 1/4, but on the whole, 60% didn't have any, and then about 1/4 were neutral on that. We were interested in whether there's a potential to remind people inadvertently about smoking when they weren't thinking about it by having all these kind of reminders and messages. And there was a small proportion of those who received these geofence triggered support who felt that it might be a negative reminder. We'll continue to observe that, but we were quite pleased that mostly people didn't find that this was a negative reminder. Certainly no one we interviewed felt that the app had triggered smoking. So how do people feel about the messages? Well, this person says, and they're talking about the geofence triggered messages here. When the messages actually came through, it was as if the program was written for me. Seriously, that is what I did feel, because it was coming through at the times when I felt I would have smoked, and that's when the support was there. So there were quite a few people who really, really felt like the messages were really well tailored to their smoking behaviour, far more than it probably was. And it may be that the effect of tailoring by personalising it and ensuring that it was personally relevant, people were sort of seeing more intelligence in the system than there really is. Not everyone felt it was all the messages were relevant though. So this person says some of them were useful and some of them seemed very daft. Yes, some were very relevant to me personally, I thought. It's very hard to please everyone, and given the volume of messages we have to deliver, we have to be quite creative, not to just be saying the same things. It's inevitable you're going to get some people who don't feel the information you're providing is personally relevant. One slightly unexpected thing, and it's probably not unexpected to most other people, it's just I think when designing the app, we were so focused on the sort of geofence triggered stuff, we weren't thinking about the effect of self-monitoring. And interestingly, just the act of reporting smoking had a kind of an immediate effect. So the people we interviewed said on their smoking behaviour. So one person says, it made me think, well, actually, do I really need a cigarette now? And this person actually said halfway through reporting they stopped and they didn't smoke as a result. Another person says, inputting, I think, am I really that stressed? Am I really that anxious in terms of needing a cigarette? So there was a sort of potential immediate impact of reporting. There was a more enduring effect as well. So this person says, that was the most important thing to start off with, is realising where in the day the pinch points were going to be and to sort of see a pattern of how much you were smoking and when you were smoking. So for some people, they were learning about the habit. I mean, that was part of the aim. So people learned a little bit more about where they were smoking and what the kind of conditions were that maybe drove their smoking behaviour. And actually, when their quit date arrived, people sort of wanted something to do. They wanted to engage with the app because they, mostly had stopped smoking. So they wanted more self-monitoring. Have a button. I'm not smoking. A resist button. People were saying. Quite a few said this. It almost like solidifies your decision not to smoke. This is another person. The process of actually being able to log that they've not smoked, perhaps when they've had a craving. And I know this is something that you do on David Crane's app that Susan mentioned earlier today. Okay, so final conclusions then, and then a future steps slide. So people were pretty positive about the app generally. 3/4 said they'd use it again. And when I say about the app, I'm talking about the concept really. So the process of training a system, self-monitoring their smoking behaviour, and receiving this kind of support that it delivers. Most geofence messages were viewed within 5 minutes, suggesting that it's sort of proof of concept for the way we were delivering the support. And there was a desire for more self-monitoring among this sample. People who were engaged in it certainly liked to do that. And these weren't people who had used smoking cessation apps before and didn't have that much app use already. So what are we going to do next? Well, users are often one step ahead of you. So this person says you can vote the messages, can't you? So that's great as well, because it means the very best and most popular ones come up first and foremost. Well, yes, you can vote, so you can rate the messages, but currently, the current system doesn't actually sort of predict what people are going to like, but that was always the plan. So by using machine learning techniques, and one in particular called collaborative filtering, something that Amazon and Netflix do to recommend products or films to you, we can predict which messages people are most likely to find useful or report finding useful based on their shared rating history with other people who are like them. And hopefully maybe we can stop there being so many daft messages being sent, as that one participant said. The second sort of future aspect, something I'm interested in, is we've only used one sensor really, or at least a combination of sensors, only looked at location. There are, as been said already, as each new phone comes on the shelves, then there are more sensors embedded. There are wearables and external sensors that people have, ones that can identify stress. There's some interesting work with a couple of groups, including one at University of Bristol, showing that the act of smoking can be detected pretty accurately with a smartwatch or wrist-worn accelerometer. So potentially you could take the user out of the equation when having to report smoking. However, based on the evidence we had on how much people talked about the act of self-monitoring, I'd be a bit hesitant to take the user out completely, because we might be missing quite a sort of potent behaviour change technique if we take them away from it completely, and it may result in higher disengagement, although that obviously remains to be seen. Okay, so that's all I was going to say, and thank you very much for listening, and don't forget any time for any questions. Thank you.